Thank you. I'm going to talk about a number of different things today related to human trafficking. This is not a new issue for anybody. It's been around for thousands and thousands of years, but it has kind of been rediscovered in the last decade or two. I actually heard about it in the early 90s when I was at a national conference and ended up going to dinner with Lou DeBaca, who grew up in Huxley, Iowa, and he was one of the Assistant Attorney General prosecutors who focused on human trafficking in the early to mid 90s. And since then, it really has grown in recognition. I think it's been happening for a very long time, but there's still a whole lot of information that we don't know. So I'm going to do kind of an overview today on a number of different issues to give you an update. And we'll talk a little bit about our Office to Combat Human Trafficking. That is part of the Department of Public Safety. We'll talk about statutory legal provisions. We'll talk about some of the investigations that are going on, some of the training opportunities for a lot of people, and some of the support programs that have grown up in the state. The Office to Combat Human Trafficking was established in 2016. It consists of two people. The coordinator is actually part-time, Sergeant Robert Deskin, and Katie Keene is our analyst, who's a full-time analyst. She focuses on law enforcement investigations of human trafficking. So the Office to Combat Human Trafficking has a number of statutory duties under Section 80.45. We're the point of contact for the human trafficking activities that are going on around the state. We consult with a lot of other people. We develop a strategy for collecting. The language of the statute says criminal history data, but we're including a lot of other information as well, trying to kind of be this central repository for a lot of the information that we have about human trafficking. Developing a strategy for information sharing among government agencies. I think we're making some progress on that already. Looking for grants, providing some research and recommendation for other government agencies, and taking other steps necessary, and then submitting a written report. We did file our first written report on November 1st, and I think we'll make that available to everyone if you're interested in finding out a little bit more about that. What you'll see today is kind of a summary of what we included in our first annual report. So human trafficking was first identified in Iowa law in 2006 when we created Chapter 710A. We've made a number of changes since then, but the changes since it began in 2006 have been relatively minor changes. Some of those changes have occurred just because there are a number of other states that have tried new things related to human trafficking, and so most of the things that you're going to find in other states you'll also find in the Iowa statute now. We did expand and better define some of the things related to the definition of human trafficking. Talk specifically about ignorance not being a defense to that, and we've changed a number of the statutes specifically toward minors, because that seems to be one of the bigger concerns that, particularly for runaway youth, they're at high risk of being drawn into human trafficking, and obviously they don't have, if they're under the age of consent, if they're involved in sex trafficking, they really cannot consent to that. So we've made some modifications to the statute to be able to more specifically address some of the minors who are trafficked. We also now provide funding for an instructor through the Iowa Law Enforcement Academy, and that covers not only the new recruits who are going through the new people who are going through the basic academy, but that instructor will also provide training across the state, specifically for local governments. So when we talk about human trafficking under Chapter 710A, there are couple of different ways that you can commit it. One is to knowingly engage in human trafficking, and there's all kinds of different ways that you can do that, causing or threatening to cause injury, cause serious physical injury, physically restraining or threatening to physically restrain someone, soliciting services or benefiting from the services of a victim, abusing or threatening to abuse the law or legal process. A lot of times that means holding on to their identification or prohibiting them or restricting them from seeking help from officials. Or specifically knowing, destroying, concealing, removing, confiscating, or possessing any actual or purported passport or other immigration document. So we are specifically addressing some of the international human trafficking that also is fairly common. And then the other option, the last one, is benefiting financially or receiving anything of value by knowingly participating in human trafficking. And you'll notice in our definition of human trafficking, it really is very broad. It covers not only sex trafficking, commercial sex trafficking, but also any other form of slavery or slavery-related activity, as well as labor trafficking. Generally speaking, it's going to be a felony, a 5-year D-felony offense unless there are aggravating factors. So the seriousness is going to depend on what kind of activity is occurring, the age of the victim, and what kind of injury results from that. The highest level that we can get with a human trafficking charge is a Class B felony for 25 years. There is an affirmative defense of compulsion. So, for example, if you have a trafficking victim who is arrested for prostitution, or if they're arrested for trafficking, if they were compelled to assist in that trafficking endeavor, then they can raise that affirmative defense of compulsion. It is a forcible felony now. It was not when it was first passed, but we've changed that. And there are no mandatory minimums, but it is a forcible felony. So once they're convicted, then they're not eligible for an appeal bond. One of the common questions that we get about human trafficking is what's the difference between human trafficking and prostitution or other prostitution-related offenses. So those are the offenses that are set out in Chapter 725, and they are generally far less serious offenses than human trafficking. You'll notice that there are a lot of things, when you talk about commercial sex trafficking, there are a lot of those different crimes that are set out in Chapter 725 that also describe some of the activity that goes on with commercial sex trafficking. So the primary difference when we talk about either prostitution or prostitution-related offenses and human trafficking is the question of voluntariness or compulsion. The presumption in the statutes dealing with prostitution, pimping, pandering, or leasing premises is that it's voluntary. And the essence of the human trafficking charge is that it is not voluntary. It involves force, fraud, or coercion. And those really are the primary ways of getting involved in human trafficking. Sometimes there's physical force that's involved, sometimes there's threats of force, sometimes there are efforts to defraud someone, but usually that means that you are drawn in without realizing that that's what's happening. So for example, we've had instances in which someone has been hired to be a nanny or a caretaker, and then once they arrive, they are actually either forced to be engaged in commercial sex trafficking, or they're forced to work without being paid. So that would be one of those fraudulent examples. Coercion is the other possibility of making threats either to the people who are being trafficked or to their families or their friends or other people. It's not uncommon in trafficking cases to get compliance from the various people that are involved by not doing harm to the person who is actually causing or trying to rebel against the trafficker, but forcing that victim to watch while others are punished for what it is that that victim has done. And so there is coercion so that they will not rebel against the trafficker in the future, because it may not hurt them, but it will hurt their friends or the other people who are being trafficked with them. The other thing to think about with human trafficking and prostitution is the actual voluntariness of prostitution. In some of the studies that have been done of prostitutes, there really is some serious question about whether the prostitution is voluntary. Many of them feel like they are controlled by the pimp or the panderer or someone else who is benefiting from that. It feels more like human trafficking than voluntary prostitution. So I think there's a clear distinction legally between prostitution and human trafficking, but from the perspective of either the prostitute or the victim, depending on how you look at it, their perspective may be very different from people who feel safe. I want to mention the federal human trafficking statutes. The federal government, as is true in a lot of different things, takes a very different approach than the state statute. So there are all kinds of things that are covered under the federal human trafficking laws. Many of them will accomplish the same kinds of things that you see under the Iowa Code, Chapter 710A, but they appear in different statutes, and the elements of the crime are different under the federal statute than they are under the state statutes. It also is very different in terms of the punishment that's involved with minors. Excuse me, the punishment under federal statutes is generally much greater than the punishment under state statutes. And in some circumstances, at least, it's easier to prove under the federal law than it is under the state law. So very often, if there are minors involved, the case will go federal rather than to be charged under state law. The ANP model is something that we frequently talk about in human trafficking, in which we distinguish the action, the means, and the purpose. So with the action, they induce, recruit, harbor, transport, provide, or obtain, either by fraud, force, fraud, or coercion, either commercial sex trafficking or labor trafficking. I will say, generally speaking, not just in Iowa, but in other places as well, we discover commercial sex trafficking and prosecute those cases more often than we do labor trafficking. And in some of the labor trafficking cases, it has been addressed through administrative procedures rather than through criminal charges. That seems to be more common to bring administrative actions related to labor. Lots of different methods of trafficking. This is separate from any legal issues, but just as a practical matter, commercial sex trafficking is pretty common and pretty noticeable if you're paying attention, if you're watching for it. Bonded labor and debt bondage among migrant laborers is fairly common, that they are paying off the debt of bringing them to the United States or essentially renting them from their family members back in their home country. So it's kind of slavery on the installment plan as opposed to just outright ownership. We do see some child soldiers, and those cases are relatively uncommon in the United States. It certainly happens in a lot of other countries more often than we see it here. Involuntary domestic servitude is one of those cases that is very hard to detect because generally the people who are involved in that kind of activity are not often observed by the public. We had one case in which there was an individual who was in an apartment just down the street from a police department, the headquarters of a police department, and rarely went outside of the house. Just stayed in the house all the time, and it was a combination of labor and sex trafficking. So those are the kinds of things that often you can hide in plain sight with those types of trafficking cases. Forced marriages are another type of human trafficking. Among the people who are arranging for those marriages or forcing people to be married, and some forced child labor. This happens, or at least it's reported fairly often in other countries. It's not reported as often here in the United States, but again, with labor trafficking cases, we have not seen very many of those prosecutions or investigations. When it comes to child labor, of course, we have a number of laws and administrative regulations that address that. And so we see some of that, but it's usually not prosecuted as a criminal case. I do want to specifically mention hotels and motels because there's a recent initiative by one of the non-government organizations, the Network Against Human Trafficking and Slavery, has partnered up with some of the Nebraska NGO folks, and they have done training specific to hotel and motel employees. This has happened in a lot of other states. I think it started in California and has happened now in a lot of other states, in which they talk with people who are employed by hotels and motels to be able to watch for the signs of human trafficking so that those hotels and motels are not facilitating human trafficking. The law enforcement folks are not putting on that training. They often will attend the training, but it's put on by the non-government organization. This is not something where law enforcement is trying to enlist people in hotels or motels to be agents of the state. It's primarily focused on helping people to identify, number one, what the signs are of trafficking, and number two, to give them some ideas on what they might be able to do if there's an indication that the people who are involved are interested in seeking help. So we try to help, well, in this training program, but also in a lot of other things, we try to make sure that people are aware of what the resources are out there so that if someone is ready to escape, that they can do so more safely and make it last. One of the other issues that has come up fairly often deals with human trafficking in massage businesses. For the legitimate licensed massage therapists, this is something that makes them a little bit crazy because it is absolutely a legitimate health benefit for people to get massages. But there are some massage parlors that serve as fronts for human trafficking. So we've seen some cases in Iowa involving massage businesses, and there's a report specific to massage businesses. One of the reasons I bring this up, though, is that it's an interesting issue right now. They just changed the statute related to regulation of a number of different businesses, and they specifically set out massage businesses for regulation at the local level. So there are provisions that will allow local governments to establish ordinances that add regulatory requirements for massage businesses. I'm featuring Johnston in part because they were behind a lot of the efforts to to beef up some of the local ordinance regulations, and I would suggest that if you represent any of the cities, or if you have an interest in human trafficking, this is one of the ways to be able to address some of the restrictions that you have on massage businesses that would help investigators to identify what's going on in the massage businesses in their areas. There have been a number of people who have raised questions and concerns about what they consider to be illegitimate massage businesses. And if you take a look at what Johnston has done with their ordinances and the information that they require for people who are going to run the business in their jurisdiction, it's a pretty good way of being able to control the massage businesses so that you are focused on legitimate massage businesses in allowing them to continue to operate and avoiding some of the massage businesses that serve as a front for commercial sex trafficking and actually also for labor trafficking. So I would suggest that you take a look at what Johnston has done to be able to look at some of those massage businesses. There is a national human trafficking hotline that is right now operated by the Polaris Project. This map covers the calls that have been made to the Polaris Project. It doesn't necessarily indicate that this is where all of the human trafficking cases are that are occurring, but this is where calls have been made. Now, what's interesting is that when you look at some of the common trafficking routes that have been identified, the calls seem to, the red parts of this map seem to follow along with some of those common human trafficking routes that we see. If we talk with the people who are familiar with human trafficking around the country, whether it's law enforcement or victim services or other advocates, it's pretty common for commercial sex trafficking in particular to go from one large event to another large event across the country. So, for example, before the Iowa State Fair, it's pretty common starting in about April for people to start advertising for commercial sex trafficking during the state fair. And that's true for a lot of the other big events. For example, one of the reasons that Nebraska has been a leader in combating human trafficking is that the College World Series was one of those places that drew a whole lot of people. And what we find when we start doing those kinds of investigations is that whatever event it is that is the draw, they usually have stopped at other events along the way. And so they will travel either regionally or nationally, going from one event to another. It's another reason that the hotels and motels are particularly interested in paying attention to commercial sex trafficking, because it's very common for the traffickers to set up in a hotel or motel and advertise for those either on a commercial site like Backpage or at some of the premium dating sites that also seem to be able to facilitate human trafficking fairly well, sex trafficking in particular. Labor trafficking, once again, we don't get as many reports, and the trafficking routes for labor trafficking, I really haven't seen a whole lot of information that I consider to be valid when it comes to labor trafficking. In terms of the investigations, one of the things that I certainly encourage people to make their calls to the national hotline. One of the concerns that we have is that there are a whole lot of tips that don't actually provide us with the information that we need to be able to follow through on investigations. So in fiscal year 17, that would be the state fiscal year, July 1st through June 30th, we had 170 tips that were tied to Iowa. Only 34 of those tips were provided to us at the Department of Public Safety. So it is entirely up to the reporting party to decide who else should have that information. So obviously a lot of those people, a lot of the reporting parties did not want the information shared with law enforcement. If it is shared with law enforcement, it comes to the Department of Public Safety and to the FBI. And when it comes to the Department of Public Safety, we pass that information along to whatever local agency has jurisdiction. We have very limited jurisdiction through the Department of Public Safety. Most of the time it's either a city police department or the county sheriff that would have jurisdiction. So we will pass that on to them. One of the reasons that we hired a criminal intelligence analyst in our Office to Combat Human Trafficking is that our analyst is able to do some general, some quick investigation to be able to identify other information that we consider to be valid that we can share with investigators or to offer those services to the local agencies when we pass that on to them. So of the 34 tips that we got in fiscal year 17, one of those tips resulted in criminal charges, 3 of them resulted in, 3 additional ones resulted in investigations. 14 of the tips that were passed on to us did not have sufficient information for us to either say that it was a crime or to be able to do anything with it. One tip was not actionable because the information that they provided was no longer available. It was outdated. They were looking at old information online. 7 of the tips are currently undetermined. The anonymous tips often are not referred to local law enforcement simply because, well, they're not referred to local law enforcement with the idea of prosecution of the case, mainly because we just simply don't have enough information. And we also, within the Department of Public Safety, don't capture the information unless we can identify a clear criminal nexus. If it's just somebody who says, well, there's a massage parlor in my neighborhood and it makes me uncomfortable, that's not enough for us to think that there's something illegal going on. We need to have a little more information than that. So I think at Polaris they ask questions and try to draw out as much information as they can, but sometimes it's either rumor or it's just not enough information for us to really be able to take any action. What we've done through our office, the Office to Combat Human Trafficking, we did some training specifically on intelligence-led policing in the last year. We've done a whole lot more training, and the Law Enforcement Academy and the Attorney General's Office have done more training. We've had training trainers come in from a lot of other areas to talk to law enforcement about this, so that we can make sure that people are providing the information that they should provide to be able to carry through with an investigation that can result in prosecution. So as a result of those efforts in fiscal year 17, we had 60 reports from law enforcement agencies that were sufficient for us to be able to do an investigation. We really don't talk about much more beyond that. We don't really want people to know just exactly which cases it is that we're investigating, but they have come from all over the state. Big cities, small towns, rural areas. We've had cases from everywhere. Some of those cases have been reported in the media. Some of them are currently pending. In order for us to do an investigation of a case, we have to have a criminal nexus and sufficient detail so that we can verify the facts, and it has to be timely so that we actually are able to conduct a genuine investigation. Those are not the standards for the tips to Polaris. They try to ask those kinds of questions for the people who are reporting, but they don't have any specific standards to be able to pass that on. And that's fine. We have no objection to that. One of my concerns is that when we report that there were 174 tips tied to Iowa, people assume that that means that we're going to have 174 investigations. That's really not the way that it works. The 60 reports that we have from law enforcement agencies, those are being investigated. In terms of the training, I mentioned we did training on intelligence-led policing. Our training that we did through the Department of Public Safety was focused on the trafficking organizations. Our goal would be to dismantle some of those organizations because it has a broader impact. The organizations usually have multiple victims that they are trafficking, and so if we can dismantle an organization, then we have a better chance of being able to recover more victims, or at least to provide services to more victims if that's a possibility. There are also trainings that the Law Enforcement Academy and the Crime Victim Assistance Division have conducted in the last year. DPS has focused on intelligence-led policing, and the ILEA and Crime Victim Assistance have focused on general investigative kinds of things. So our focus is on organizations, and ILEA and the Attorney General are focused more on individual investigations of cases. So we're complementing each other and not competing with each other. There's actually a plan for us to be able to provide that training to law enforcement. We've also done lots of training around the state, not just our department, but Iowans in general have done a pretty fair amount of training for lawyers, particularly for lawyers that are involved in juvenile representation and the lawyers who are involved in criminal issues. We've done training for judges in Iowa. Again, the emphasis is on juveniles, mainly because the runaway youth and the at-risk youth are particularly at risk for trafficking. What we're finding with traffickers is that the younger the child, the higher the payout, and the more people are willing to pay. It's not uncommon for children to be trafficked at age 8 and sometimes even younger than age 8. It used to be that we would say that 12 to 14 was probably the age where trafficking would begin. The more we find out about it, the more we realize that there really is no lower level age. We're now starting to see kids who are under 5 who are being trafficked. The Children's Justice Project has included human trafficking topics in a lot of the training that they've done. The judicial branch in Iowa also put on a multidisciplinary training about a year ago that was really very well done, very successful, and covered all kinds of different things. Victim services, lots of training for them. The Crime Victim Assistance Division in the Attorney General's office has some grant funding that's available. They actually have a pretty fair amount of grant funding available for training, not just for victim advocates and victim counselors, but for anyone really who is interested in doing training related to human trafficking. One of the issues that we have when we talk about victim services is that for those victims of trafficking, their needs are very high, and they may be different from the needs of other crime victims. So finding the right kind of program that matches their needs may be difficult. And although there are some similarities between the trafficking victimization experience and some of the other victimization experiences, there are also some unique aspects of it. And so the training that has been done for victim advocates and victim counselors has included a component that specifically addresses human trafficking. We've also seen a whole lot of training related to the public. The goal is to increase public awareness so that if people are seeing anything that looks like human trafficking, that they will report it and they will try to take some kind of action. They'll try to identify what can be done to address the problem. Deterrence is another piece of it. We haven't really seen as much deterrence training as I would like to see. If we reduce the demand, it certainly is going to have an enormous impact on human trafficking. In some jurisdictions, they've had what's been called a John School, where they are doing training for buyers to have them understand what life is like for the prostitutes or the human trafficking victims that they have encountered, in the hope that they will not go back and not demand the commercial sex services in the future. The research on that indicates that not everybody benefits from one of those schools, so you have to make sure that you are picking out the right people to be able to go to one of those schools. Lots of prevention efforts going on. I'm hearing more and more from school officials and from youth organizations about what kinds of things they can do for prevention and detection, so that they can watch out for the at-risk kids and try to identify what they may be able to do to prevent or provide for early detection. A lot of the non-government organizations are very focused on fundraising. If we're going to have programs to address the needs of those victims, they're very expensive, and so I appreciate all of the fundraising work that they do. From an investigator's perspective, having victims with access to resources means that they're far more likely to help with the investigation. It's safer for them to be able to do that. So having those programs makes a big difference. And coordination of resources. We work with the non-government organizations on a pretty regular basis. We want to make sure that everybody throughout the system is coordinating as best they can. In that regard, put this one on your calendar, April 17th and 18th of next year at Prairie Meadows. We're planning a multidisciplinary training. We hope that it will be very similar to what the Children's Justice Project put on last year for human trafficking. So mark those dates on your calendar. We'd love to see more lawyers attending that. I touched on this before. When we talk about support for survivors of human trafficking, their needs are everything. And you know, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the physiological needs are the baseline needs, and until you have a place to live and enough food to eat, and you feel safe, you really can't move on to very many other things. For trafficking victims, if their lives have been controlled by a trafficker, they need absolutely everything: food, clothing, and shelter. Many times they need health care. For commercial sex trafficking, what we find very often when we encounter victims of commercial sex trafficking, the very first thing that we do is to ask them, when's the last time that you ate? And what is it that you're hungry for right now? Because they are absolutely starved. Literally, they have been starved. Transportation is a problem for them to be able to. Sometimes they don't have a driver's license at all, and sometimes they don't know how to use other alternatives besides their own vehicle. Counseling and substance abuse are absolutely essential. Substance abuse is very common, particularly in commercial sex trafficking. Sometimes payment happens through controlled substances, through drugs, and sometimes the traffickers drug the victims because then they can control what happens in their lives a whole lot easier. And it's pretty common for us to see an intersection between particularly commercial sex trafficking and drug trafficking. When you look at some of the national routes of human trafficking, commercial sex trafficking, and drug trafficking, it's pretty much the same routes. And I'm sure it's not a surprise to anybody in Iowa that would include Interstate 80 and Interstate 35. So we're a pretty popular place for people to pass through, and a lot of times when they're passing through, they don't just pass through, they also stop and look for customers here in Iowa as well. Counseling is a big problem for the survivors of human trafficking. Usually before they started, they had some issues, and being trafficked does not make the issues better. It just makes it much harder for them. And they have moved from total control to something other than total control when they are able to escape those trafficking organizations. So it's a difficult counseling challenge to be able to address some of those issues. Legal services are also important. Sometimes they have literally lost their identity, and they have all kinds of other legal issues. Very often what made them vulnerable in the first place had some kind of legal issue involved, and so they need to get all of those kinds of things resolved. For commercial sex trafficking, a lot of times they're the ones who are charged with prostitution, so their criminal defense attorneys can help them to get resources that they need and be able to address the criminal charges against them. There are just all kinds of other issues that come up, and we have found, in particular, we have found legal aid, Iowa legal aid, to be of tremendous help when we've had cases involving trafficking victims. Legal aid seems to have all kinds of information about every resource that's available all across the state, and it really helps a lot in making it possible for those victims to escape the trafficking. Safety planning, really important. When we have traffickers who have a sense of ownership of the people that they traffic, they are unsafe. And so they really need to think about where they can live, how they can live, and what their vulnerabilities are in order for them to stay safe. It is not at all uncommon for victims of trafficking to be drawn back into it either by force, fraud, or coercion. And traffickers who have that sense of ownership certainly will do everything that they can to continue to own those victims. Because we don't have nearly as many cases involving labor trafficking, we don't have quite as much information about what's happening in Iowa, but we would expect the same kinds of things to be happening in labor trafficking, or at least many of the same things that we see with commercial sex trafficking as well. It depends a little bit on whether the labor trafficking involves something that's closer to slavery as opposed to debt bondage. The other thing that we notice with a lot of the survivors of human trafficking is that they either dropped out of high school and need to get an education, or that they don't have other opportunities for legitimate work, for non-criminal vocations, and that of course they have no money. So providing some kind of program for them to be able to get their GED or to move on to other education certainly is going to help them, and to provide those skills for non-criminal jobs is extremely important. These are just some of the primary support programs that we see around the state. We have lots of other programs as well, but these are the ones that we seem to work with most often. And they are generally regional kinds of organizations, so it's not limited to the particular city where they are, and a lot of times they have satellite offices outside of wherever their main office is. Most of these organizations are organizations that provide public awareness, and they may provide some counseling services. Sometimes there are shelter services available, but it varies greatly from one program to another. I will say one of the interesting and innovative programs from Breaking Traffic recently was a focus on kids in high schools, middle schools, and now elementary schools, where they are trying to get the word out to kids that if there is someone who is trying to traffic them, that there are other opportunities for them, there are other options for them to be able to avoid that. And we've had a couple of speakers who have experience from around the country who have said, if you're waiting until they're in high school, you're waiting too long. Middle school is the probably the most dangerous time for them. The traffickers make a whole lot more money with middle schoolers. The middle schoolers tend to be a little more amenable to the force, fraud, and coercion, and they make more money for the traffickers. And in middle school, they tend to have fewer adults who are watching over them quite as closely. So those school programs, I think, are extremely important when we talk about prevention and deterrence and also detection. So how much human trafficking is there? Well, you're going to see all kinds of studies and you're going to see all kinds of numbers. And of course, I am kind of a stickler when it comes to statistics, and would suggest that we should be very wary of the numbers that we see. We don't really have a good sense of what the numbers are, and the same is true for all kinds of hidden crimes. There are a lot of different ways that you can measure crimes that are occurring that are not noticeable to the public. But the things that I would suggest when people are, particularly when people are using numbers that you just see those and think, well, that can't possibly be true. Well, frequently it's not true. So the suggestions that I would make when you're assessing the validity of the statistic that you see, does it cite to the source? If they don't cite to the source, then you really should question whether those numbers are correct. Is it a reliable source? Are they based on official statistics? If they are official statistics, those numbers are fine, and generally they are pretty reliable. They also are pretty limited because those are the cases that have come to the attention of officials. So they're valid numbers, but they don't measure the hidden part of crime. Opinion surveys, not particularly helpful if you're asking people what is your impression of what's happening in your community. Those are actually pretty worthless. Is it a broad sample or is it a small group? If it's a small group, are you going to be able to generalize what you hear from a small group to the entire country or to the entire state or to the entire community? Those small samples are really not, unless you know that they're representative, they're not going to be very helpful. So, you know, with the Iowa poll, you're not asking very many people, but Ann Selzer knows what she's doing when she's picking out the people that she polls. And if you're an aficionado of 538, it's the same thing. They know how to poll. They know how to take samples that are representative. Does it properly define trafficking? Is that definition similar to what our statute says? Is it a general definition of trafficking? What exactly is being measured? Does it identify a time frame for those numbers? If you're conflating different time periods, then they really are not comparable. Do the conclusions go beyond what was actually measured? And is it anecdotal rather than systematic? I can tell you lots of stories because we've had quite a number of cases related to human trafficking. But are those anecdotes representative of what's happening with sex trafficking or labor trafficking in Iowa? I'm not sure that we know enough to be able to draw that kind of conclusion. So here are some of the reliable statistics. The frustration, of course, in having reliable statistics is that it usually is a pretty small sample. It involves official statistics in a particular, this one involves specific programs, and they are collecting information in a reliable way. They tell you the time frame, they tell you what's measured, they limit the conclusions to those things that are measured, and specifically tell you what the limitations are for that. Another one, this one is interesting. It's a very broad-based kind of thing. It was this is information that was collected by the United Nations, and there's a whole lot of other studies that have come up with the same kinds of answers. So it's what statisticians refer to as convergence. When you see the same thing from a variety of different studies conducted in a variety of different ways, and you get kind of the same answers, then convergence tells you that probably is something that you can count on. So the same is true for these for the human trafficking routes. We generally have a pretty good idea of what those routes are just based on all of the different ways that we can collect information. So when and where might you encounter trafficking in your practice? As I've said a number of times, juveniles are at risk. So if you are representing juvenile delinquents or child welfare cases, those are the ones where you really should be thinking seriously about whether the clients that you're encountering or the people that you're encountering in those cases are being trafficked. If they are referring to a family member, a daddy or my cousin or some other relative, are they really a relative? Or is that somebody that is part of a trafficking organization? Because very often those trafficking organizations portray themselves as families. And so members of the organization are viewed as family members. So when they're describing a relative, is it actually a relative, or is it somebody who's part of a trafficking organization? At-risk youth are at risk of being trafficked as well, so pay particular attention to those things. Immigration is another one. We do have a pretty fair number of immigrants in Iowa. We also have refugees in Iowa. With the refugees, the immigration issues are completely different for refugees than they are for immigrants, but socially, it may be very similar. So they may not have legal issues related to immigration, but refugees also, when we talk about people who are at risk, refugees are at risk. By definition, they have come from countries where there's a great deal of strife. Otherwise, they wouldn't qualify as refugees. So when we talk about immigration, I also want to make sure that we include refugees in that consideration. Iowa is actually a pretty popular place for refugees. In the Des Moines Public School District, they speak more than 200 different languages right now because we have so many different types of refugees from all over the world. And so the language barriers are a big problem. The mistrust of government is also very common among refugees, so they may not seek help. And if they are refugees, they often are closely tied to other people in that refugee community, and they're less likely to trust outsiders, so they are, once again, extremely vulnerable. For immigrants, not refugees, but immigrants, of course, they have tremendous concerns about deportation and other actions that may be taken against them. Labor trafficking, I think, in particular, is a concern. What we've seen, at least in a lot of other states, is that in agricultural economies, a lot of migrant laborers and a lot of other non-migrant laborers, people who are here to work in factories or in packing plants, those kinds of places, fairly common for labor trafficking to occur. At least that's what we've seen in other jurisdictions, and to some extent in Iowa as well. You may also be representing some of those businesses that would benefit from labor trafficking or from sex trafficking. The sex trafficking usually involves places like hotels and motels, but also apartments. One of the disadvantages of focusing on hotels and motels in terms of sex trafficking is that these traffickers are making thousands of dollars a week. So it's actually cheaper for them very often to just buy or to rent apartments or to buy houses. And they have plenty of cash to be able to do that. So if you're representing people who are engaged in real estate, you may want to pay attention to that as well, about whether they are facilitating trafficking. Obviously, in criminal cases, trafficking matters, and you'll know the trafficking case when the criminal charges are brought. But I would also suggest that you think about whether a criminal defendant is also a victim of human trafficking, whether it's labor trafficking or sex trafficking. If we can get lawyers to pay attention, then I think we may be able to identify the cases and provide some good resources for people. If you have healthcare clients, that's another one. Very often the victims of trafficking end up going to the doctor. Commercial sex trafficking often involves sexually transmitted diseases, so they're going to see healthcare providers on a fairly regular basis. They may have serious issues because they are underfed or because they're severely beaten, so they may have broken bones and other things that healthcare providers are going to be addressing. So if you have healthcare clients, make sure that they think about being able to identify trafficking victims. Public presentations, if you are interested in doing public presentations, I'm happy to share whatever information you might be interested in. People love to hear from lawyers. Lawyers tend to be pretty interesting speakers. And so if this is something that is of interest to you and you need more information, please do let me know. The other ones that I really recommend, if you are interested in this, is the Any Kid Anywhere video. This was produced by Breaking Traffic in the Quad Cities. It talks about Iowans, people who have connections to Iowa and to the Quad Cities. They now have it online through Vimeo, so you can watch that one. Tricked is a really good discussion of trafficking, sex trafficking, commercial sex trafficking, and really does a great job of distinguishing between prostitution and commercial sex trafficking. And on PBS, A Path Appears. This is a really good one that talks about commercial sex trafficking primarily, but it also features a program in Nashville that provides tremendous support for the survivors of human trafficking. So if you're interested in programming for survivors, this is a really good one to take a look at. So if you have questions or concerns, feel free to contact me or to contact Sergeant Deskin, who's our coordinator of the Office to Combat Human Trafficking. We'll be happy to answer whatever questions we may be able to answer.